For those of you who don't know me, my name is Denise Demetriou. I'm a faculty member in the history department at UCSD, and together with today's speaker at Watts, I serve as the co-director of the Center for Hellenic Studies. Thank you all for coming to this celebration today. It's a celebration because this year marks the 10th year anniversary of when the Alkiviadis Vassiliadis chair was filled. And the first person to hold it is Ed Watts, who is going to be our speaker today. We wanted to celebrate this moment, and we wanted to celebrate our supporters among the community here in San Diego, and also to celebrate Ed and his accomplishments as well. And so to help me do that, we are going to begin today's events with some remarks from the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, Cristina Della Coletta.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for inviting me to help celebrate this occasion by welcoming everybody in attendance. While we certainly recognize being in person is the most ideal, I am grateful we were able to move quickly to this remote format. As leaders on campus, we often talk about learning from the past 3 years. Making last-minute adjustments and using this virtual format are just two of those lessons. As are looking at the big picture and being conscious of how our actions impact many. Of course, I don't need to tell this group about the importance of learning from the past. Today is a celebration of our incredible Department of History, as much as it is a thank you to all of our supporters of Byzantine, ancient, and modern Greek history. In fact, those three endowed chairs, the Vassiliadis chair in Byzantine Greek history, the Ranglas chair in ancient Greek history, and the Nicholas family chair in modern Greek history, form one of the most cohesive and complete academic and research programs in Greek history in the United States and perhaps even the world. By endowing these chairs, you not only give the opportunity to our faculty members to carry out groundbreaking research, you're also helping to pass along this knowledge and expertise to our graduate students, and you're most definitely sparking an appreciation and interest in the foundational skills history brings to our undergraduates. For 10 years, Edward Watts has held the Alkiviadis Vassiliadis Endowed Chair in Byzantine Greek history. And for 10 years, Ed has played a crucial role in building the graduate program, a program that engages with Byzantine and Roman history in creative and groundbreaking ways. Ed, please accept my gratitude for your leadership, for your work and commitment. Without a doubt, our three chairholders are excellent researchers, and their contributions to UC San Diego are outstanding. They are also good public citizens, for they are eager to bring their work to you in the community. And we're eager to hear. Congratulations, and thank you all for celebrating with us this event. Back to you, Denise.
Thank you, Cristina. And now let me introduce my colleague, Tom Gallant, distinguished professor in the Nicholas Family Endowed Chair in Modern Greek History, who will introduce Ed.
Thank you, Denise. And thank you for inviting me to introduce Ed for this wonderful occasion. I'd so look forward to being able to see you all in person after an unconscionably long time. But unfortunately, that celebration will have to wait, hopefully not too much into the future. Well, condensing Ed's record down into a brief introduction is a Herculean, if not impossible task. So I set myself the task of doing that in 1,000 words. And even then, I had to cut large sections of my talk out, of my presentation out, to get it to where it is, because it is such a rich and full record that it is almost impossible to distill it down into a brief introduction, but I'll do my best. After serving on committees seeking to fill an endowed chair and having been a candidate for a number of such positions, it strikes me that the process is like the anecdote you may have heard about how do porcupines mate, to which the answer is, and that's because invariably the finalists, let alone the successful candidate, stand at the pinnacle of their field or are well on the way to doing so. And that was certainly the case with the Vassiliadis chair. After an exhaustive search over 2 years, Ed emerged as the leading candidate. Then after a series of negotiations, he accepted our offer and he took up the chair in 2012. And that brings us to today's celebration of the 10th anniversary of the chair's inauguration. Ed has compiled a record of excellence that ranks him amongst the world's leading scholars on late antique and Byzantine history. Received his PhD in 2002 from Yale, making this also the 20th anniversary of his dissertation. And he was appointed that year to the history department at Indiana University. There he earned tenure and was promoted to associate in 2007, and then to full professor in 2011. And then, of course, we hired him away from Indiana in 2012. He is a prolific writer whose works have drawn academic and popular attention. For time's sake, I'll only focus on his most recent books. Published in 2015, his third book, The Final Pagan Generation, offers a history of the men born in the 310s who lived through the 4th century's dramatic religious and political changes. It was such an impressive work that it was awarded the 2015 Phi Alpha Theta Best Subsequent Book Prize. His fourth book, Hypatia, The Life and Legend of an Ancient Philosopher, recounts the life of a woman whose work redefined philosophy. Whose death resonated as a symbol of the dramatic religious and social change in the early 5th century. In 2018, he published Mortal Republic, in which he offers a new history of the fall of the Roman Republic. Most recently, in 2021, came The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, The History of a Dangerous Idea. In it, he tells the stories of the people who built their political and literary careers around promises of Roman renewal, as well as those of the victims they blame for causing Rome's decline. And as with all of his previous work, this one has received a very warm reception. Unless this has changed, the last time we spoke about this, he's now researching a massive book that traces the Romanization and de-Romanization of the Mediterranean world between 96 and 850 AD, a modest task. As I suggested earlier, his work speaks not only to academics, but to popular audience as well. And he has been very active in disseminating his scholarship, which has been featured in The Economist, The New York Times, Time Magazine, The New Yorker, Smithsonian, and National Public. None of my comments so far, I should note, touch on his voluminous article record, the lengthy list of talks he has presented to academic and lay audiences around the world, or to the numerous collections of essays that he has co-edited. All this is by way of saying that Ed is one of the world's leading historians of late antiquity and early Byzantium. Almost as impressive as his scholarship is his contribution to the establishment and continued success of UC San Diego's Center for Hellenic Studies. Since my arrival in 2007, there were plans to create such a center, but it really took Ed's arrival in 2012 to make those plans a reality. He and I put in many long hours completing all of the steps needed to bring it into existence, and so it was in 2014. Over its first 2 years, Ed and I co-directed it, charting the course of its projected development and undertaking all that. A major step in the center's progress was the appointment of Denise Demetriou to the Ranglas Endowed Chair in Ancient Greek History in 2014. She has chaired the center from 2016 to 2022, and she and Ed will be co-directors until 2026. I should also point out that in between his stints co-directing the center, Ed happened to find time to chair the history department. By any measure, the center has been a great success. It offers a slate of popular undergraduate courses, as well as providing each year a rich way of and cultural events. It has institutional linkages to universities around the world and has brought to campus many of the leading scholars in Greek history. It has been instrumental to all of this. But here I want to focus just on one area, and it is one in which Ed has been especially active, and that is graduate education, a very appropriate topic given what is going on around campus. Currently, there are 16 graduate students in the Center to Greek History, 4 each in ancient, Byzantine, and modern Greek history. And to date, no less than 6 of our students have earned their doctorates, have published or are in the process of publishing their dissertations of books, and have gotten jobs. Because of all of the hard work that Denise and Ed have put in, the Center is now a recognized program in Greek history in the English-speaking world. From the onset, it was clear that if the Center was going to have any chance of success, it had to be built upon a solid foundation that the 3 chairs, like 3 legs of a stool, would provide. Thus, the chairholders needed to be not just prolific scholars of high statures in their field, but also dedicated and tireless program builders. In Ed Watts, UCSD got all of that in spades. Ed's academic profile is a model of what a chairholder should be, and his many contributions, the history department, the university, and the profession speak for themselves. It is then with great pleasure and honor that I introduce my dear friend and colleague, Ed Watts, to speak to us today on this, the 10th anniversary of the inauguration of the Vassiliadis Endowed Chair in Byzantine History. Ed.
Thank you so much, Tom. That's, wow. That's just so, it just means so much to me to be introduced by you. And also, it's wonderful. It's been really, really wonderful to work with you over the last 10 years. I'll talk a lot about the community and the dear friends that we've made in the last, well, in a few minutes, but I have to say I met most of those people through Tom. Tom came here and did a really, really wonderful job in connecting with the community and understanding what the community represents and the very special people and very special gifts that they have to provide. And Tom let me know how wonderful these people were. And Tom introduced me to every single one of them, telling me who they were and what they'd done and what they had done to build the things that we have here. And then allowed me to work alongside him to realize his dream of creating a world-class Center for Hellenic Studies here. I think, Tom, you understate how much you had to do with that. That really is something that happened because of your drive and your vision and your ambition. And we're just privileged to be able to take the next step and build on what you imagined this could be. But also, between Tom's own path-breaking research on ancient and modern Greece, his tremendous experience in program building in many institutions, not just at UCSD, and his incredible generosity to students and colleagues, working with you, Tom, has been one of the absolute best parts of being here. It really was essential to the experience. And so I'm really honored and I'm really touched that you were able to introduce me today. And and I look forward to continuing to work with you as the center continues to grow and develop. So thank you so much for that. So I'm going to share my screen right now and launch into things. So this is the 10th annual Vassiliadis lecture, and I thought that it would be good to talk a bit about how we got here. So as many of you know, and as Dean Della, Coletta, and Tom both mentioned, UCSD is the only institution in the Western Hemisphere with 3 endowed chairs covering all periods of Greek history. And this is the product of the vision of Georgios Anastopoulos, the organizational work of George Karetas, and the incredible generosity of the community around us. But in many ways, the creation and funding of these endowed chairs really was the beginning of an extremely rewarding relationship between the historians at UCSD and the community in general. And I came, I think, maybe in the middle or not even the middle, closer to the end of this process. I arrived a little more than 10 years ago as the first occupant of the Vassiliadis Endowed Chair in Byzantine Greek history. And I took this job because UCSD offered a really unique chance to change the way that we think about the nearly 1,500 years of Greek history between the end of the ancient period and the Ottoman conquest. And UCSD was and still is a young university that's willing to put tremendous resources behind a vision to try something new. And I'll be honest, Tom and Seth Lair and Carol sold me on this. And I was really eager to give this my best shot. I don't think that I was in San Diego for more than about a week when I first met Carol Vassiliadis in the office of Seth Lair, who was then the dean. So a little bit of background to me. I grew up in New Jersey and I went to school in New England, but I had spent the last decade of my life in Indiana at that point. And Indiana is a place, probably you know, where people are unfailingly polite and unfailingly hesitant to ever tell you what they want done or what they think about your ideas. And this is perhaps why I so enjoyed talking to Carol when I first got here, because she too had a vision for what this chair would be. And she was very frank about it. She hoped that I would do exciting research, exciting teaching, but she also trusted me to pursue that work in the way that I thought best. The meeting lasted perhaps for an hour at most, but I came away from it understanding that Carol and her family shared my ambition to do something new, exciting, and innovative at UCSD. And so over the years, my family and I have become close with Carol. I've always enjoyed talking to her about my research, sharing books with her, and most of all, drawing on her experience as a teacher to think in new ways about how I work with my students. And from the initial launch event that she hosted at her home until today, she also has been instrumental in transforming the UCSD Center for Hellenic Studies from an idea to a well-funded, well-functioning reality. And I'll also say my kids love her too. We still remember sitting down with Carol at an event in 2015 and listening to her as she talked to Nathaniel, my son, about her childhood in Queens, riding the same bus as Donald Trump. He thought he was talking to, you know, someone from the heavens. It was incredible. I could never have imagined finding such a good friend when we moved here. And I also never expected to find such a wonderful, welcoming community in San Diego. I love talking about fun places to travel and amazing art with Alexia and Paul Annas, ancient and modern politics with Jeanette Rogopoulos, interesting new books with John and Renee Grevis, baseball with Cristina and Alex Kremedin, recipes and coins with Cristina Vassiliadis, college year in Athens and the decorations of obscure Orthodox churches around the world with Jeannie and Gerry Ranglas, the wonders of Athens with Carol Tasaku, Greek language with Penny and George Nicholas, and the future of Hellenism with James Nicholas. Scholars dream of finding themselves surrounded by such interesting, fun, and supportive people. But the community has also been an amazing resource, not just for our research, but also for our students. They've supported our graduate students through endowments, fellowships, and travel grants to the tune of around $40,000 a year. I think a number of the students who've benefited from this are here today. The Hellenic Cultural Society also has helped our graduate students in many, many ways. They helped us weather the COVID crisis of the summer of 2020. They also spearheaded a fundraising drive to cover the tuition, travel, and expenses of a talented young undergraduate who'd been accepted to do Byzantine studies at Oxford. She's now learning Greek and thriving at Oxford because of what Alexia Annas, the Hellenic Cultural Society, and other members of the community were able to put together for her. And community financial support for the Center for Hellenic Studies has also led to regular awarding of travel grants, graduate student research, and a program that matches undergraduate students to professors with whom they can work as research assistants. None of this would have been possible without the sustained financial, logistical, and especially emotional support that the San Diego Greek community has given us. And it's hard to imagine what our program would be like without this support. People like Carol, Alexia, Paul, Cristina, James, and Jeanette don't just make the tangible aspects of our program better. My conversations with them have also deeply influenced the way I think about, research, and write about the Greek world. In fact, much of the work that I've done in recent years has grown out of these conversations. But this is especially true of what I'm going to spend my time talking about for the rest of today. And that's the topic of Greek Romans and Roman Greeks. This initially interested me because of many conversations I've had with Carol, Alexia, James Nicholas, and other friends about how the people we call Byzantines actually saw themselves as a people whose culture, history, and language was an amalgamation of Greek and Roman. Byzantine is a word we made up. It's not a word that they used to describe themselves. And these conversations, they stuck with me, and they became increasingly interested as I talked to other members of the community over the years. So I heard, for example, how in the very recent past, Greek speakers in different parts of the Mediterranean have called themselves Romans, even into the 20th and 21st century. A few years ago, someone in the community told me a story about Greek soldiers arriving in Rhodes following its incorporation into the Greek state after World War II. Those soldiers called themselves Hellenes, and the Rhodian population Romanoi. Just a few weeks ago at an event at St. Constantine in Helena, another person told me about visiting some of the Greek-speaking villages in southern Italy. The people there still call themselves Romanoi. And these Greek speakers are the last vestiges of what was once a Roman nation that extended from Britain to Saudi Arabia and held as much as a quarter of the world's population. What we call the Byzantine Empire was called Romania by the Romanoi who lived there. Even the language we now call Greek was called Romanica by its speakers in the Middle Ages. But of course, it wasn't always this way. Greeks were not always Romans, and Romans were not always Greek. So in the past few years, as Tom mentioned, I've been working on a book that has actually expanded from 96 to 800 to all of Roman history, from the 8th century BC to 1453 AD. And the point of this is to talk about how the state begins as a Latin-speaking pagan settlement on a hill in central Italy in the 8th century BC and ends as what we would now call a Greek-speaking Christian city in Constantinople in 1453 AD. And so today I want to present what I think is the key moment in that process of evolution, the moment in the 2nd century AD that shows us a time when Greeks were simultaneously and unapologetically both Greek and Roman. So we can start in Athens. 3 tall hills frame the ancient core of the city of Athens. The first of these is the flat plateau on which the Athenian Acropolis and the Parthenon sit. The second of these, the steep peak of Lykavitos, is now recognizable by the beautiful white Christian church perched on top of it. Modern visitors largely ignore the third hill, the Museion Hill, that rises southwest of the Acropolis. So you can see the Museion Hill over there. Panoramic views of the Acropolis, Piraeus, Salamis, and on a clear day, Megara and Corinth enchant the few tourists who make the climb to its top. But even these intrepid sightseers usually ignore the ruins that cap this hill. And this brings us to the tall funerary monument set up around 116 AD to honor Gaius Julius Antiochus Philopappos. Now, this monument has great personal significance for me. It was here that I got engaged to my wife, Monesi. And it was here that we returned 10 years after we got married. And the Philopappos, if we're being honest, was my hastily chosen second choice spot for our engagement after my first choice didn't work out. It was an accident, and I couldn't tell her very much about the monument at the time. I think I muttered something about it being very old, and then I started pointing out other sites to her to distract her from the fact that I had no idea what I was talking about. And so after all that she's done over the past 25 years to support me in my work, it's only fitting that she's here today to finally hear me say something that I hope is intelligent about the Philopappos. So the Philopappos monument is dedicated to the honor and the memory of a man named Philopappos. And Philopappos claimed many identities during his life, each of which might seem irreconcilable to a 21st century observer. He was a descendant of one of the last kings of the great Seleucid royal family that ruled Syria and the largest segment of Alexander the Great's empire after his death. Philopappos was also an Athenian citizen who paid the expenses for all the Athenian tribes competing in a choral competition. And he was a Roman senator who served as Roman consul in 109. His funerary monument actually advertises all 3 of these identities. It also does little to explain what, aside from the person of Philopappos himself, could coherently unite these distinctive Roman, Athenian, and Hellenistic royal aspects of his life. Now, Philopappos' monument stood within the Athenian city limits, just barely, but within the Athenian city limits, on some of the most visually arresting real estate available. And this is a significant concession because Athenians had effectively prevented burials within the city walls for centuries. A nearly square base supported the multi-story semicircular superstructure, as well as the tomb in which Philopappos was buried. And there were two levels of sculptural reliefs. The lower relief, this is the lower relief, shows a figure wearing a toga and a tunic and standing in a chariot drawn by 4 horses. In front of him are 6 lictors holding the consular fasces. So this is then a Roman scene that depicts Philopappos in Roman clothing and represents the moment when he assumed the consulship, the most prestigious office a Roman senator could hold. But on the second level, we see Philopappos defined again. He's nude from the waist up, and his lower body is covered by hematon, an iconography that evokes the statues of Greek heroes. And 2 of Philopappos' ancestors flank him. On one side is Philopappos' grandfather, Antiochus IV, the last king of Commagene, who's enthroned like a Hellenistic king, but wearing a Roman toga to mark his submission to Roman power. On the other side of Philopappos, that is now lost, stood a statue of Seleucus Nicator, a more distant ancestor and the founder of the Seleucid dynasty. Now, there can be no doubt that the central figures on each level represent Philopappos. Philopappos, the Greek hero, sits directly above Philopappos, the Roman consul, separated only by a Greek inscription that identifies Philopappos and his Athenian deme. Other inscriptions on the side of Philopappos' portrait also identify him, each using a different formulation to describe his position and ancestry. So one of these is an inscription that reads, King Antiochus Philopappos, son of King Epiphanes, son of Antiochus. So this is the same man with the same ancestors, but all of them are now framed in a way that advertise their Hellenistic royal lineage and Philopappos' now theoretically royal claim. But to the left is a Latin inscription that reads, Gaius Julius Antiochus Philopappos, the son of Gaius of the Fabian tribe, consul, Arval brethren, admitted to the Praetorian rank by the Emperor Caesar Nerva Trajan, Optimus Augustus Germanicus Daciacus. This is again the same Philopappos with the same father, but he and his father are both now identified using their Roman legal names. Philopappos himself is further defined by his Roman voting tribe, his Roman cultic service as one of the Arval brethren, and the privileged social status that the Emperor Trajan granted to him. So modern scholars have struggled to describe how the diverse components of this monument fit together. One of them, the most prominent scholars written about this, actually called it an iconographical nightmare. But an ancient viewer wouldn't have been confused at all, because this is Philopappos as he saw himself. He was simultaneously Hellenistic royalty, an Athenian citizen and benefactor, and a Roman consul and priest. All of these markers of status defined him in specific contexts, but none of them defined him all of the time. So when he attended the Senate, for example, Philopappos would wear a toga and be referred to by his Roman legal name. It would be the height of arrogance and maybe even seditious to refer to himself as King Antiochus Philopappos in that context. But it also made no sense to speak about his Athenian deme. That had no relevance in Rome. But it would also be equally inappropriate for Philopappos to refer to himself as king or consul when he presided over an Athenian choral competition. In that context, only his deme and his Athenian nomenclature were most appropriate to mention. The other identifiers were either irrelevant or potentially even offensive. Only Philopappos the man served as the vessel that unified these diverse aspects of his person. And so this monument commemorated Philopappos by showcasing his Roman, Athenian, and Hellenistic royal identities, because one couldn't disregard any of them without also disregarding an essential part of who Philopappos was. So this monument suggests a new way to consider the dynamic between Greek and Roman identities in the 2nd century. It's of course rather difficult for us to say, or for us to see if people identify as Romans when we not only live more than a millennium removed from the people who might give us this answer, but also must contend with the loss of the material remains of much of their lives. And even when the material we do have exists, sometimes it's very difficult to interpret. So how, for example, does one understand the famous 2nd century rhetorician Aelius Aristides, taking evident pride in both his Roman citizen status, his Greek cultural heritage, and his status as one of the most prominent residents of the city of Smyrna. And how does the Greek Aristides' view of his Romanness compare with that of his contemporary? Julianus the Zagrencian, a Moroccan tribal chieftain who was given citizenship by the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as a reward for his loyalty to Rome. Aristides and Julianus shared Romanness, but it likely didn't mean the same thing to each of them. And this is because Aristides, Julianus, and millions of other Romans paired their Romanness with other non-Roman identities. Aristides, for example, embraced both his connection to Rome and to his home region of Asia Minor. And despite his Roman citizenship, Julianus and his family continued to live and be governed by the local customs of the Zagrencian community to which they belong. Philopappos' iconographic nightmare points to a significant historical challenge. In antiquity as today, people can have multiple identities that they embrace and express in ways that might look contradictory to an outsider. But to any particular individual, these identities are not contradictory at all. So as scholars of Chicanx history in the US have shown, it's perfectly natural for someone in California who's of Mexican heritage to identify with both American and Mexican identities. This shirt is a perfect example of that. Similarly, a figure like Julianus could proudly display his grant of Roman citizenship in a beautifully carved Latin inscription erected in a city bath complex like that, while also maintaining his traditional status as a Zagrencian leader. But an outsider with an incomplete picture of this person's activities might miss one of these identities. We know one way in which Julianus expresses his Romanness, but we have little idea of how exactly he continued to express his Zagrencian identity. But at the same time, neither identity is false or contrived or manufactured. Both are real and historically notable. And this is the message that Philopappos is sending. And it's also a message we can see reflected in different forms by Philopappos' friend, the famous biographer and philosopher Plutarch of Chaeronea. Plutarch, a Boeotian Greek who possessed both Athenian and Roman citizenship and held a priesthood at Delphi, advertised these identities in a fashion that is both more nuanced and less clearly discerned than that of Philopappos. This has much to do with the immense quantity and diversity of Plutarch's writings. Perhaps 1/3 of what he once published still survives, but these extant works still take up more than 30 volumes in the Loeb Classical Library. And this is a literary career that stretched across 6 decades. And in that, Plutarch wrote philosophical treatises, antiquarian works, essays on practical ethics, a collection of biographies of Roman emperors, and the Parallel Lives, the famous project in which he paired biographies of Greek and Roman figures whose careers and characters Plutarch judged to be similar. One theme becomes clear amid all of this diversity. Plutarch used these works to claim for himself a specific sort of cultural and social status as a leading philosophical authority within a circle of educated Italian and Hellenic Romans who shared an affinity for Greek culture. Much of this grew out of personal connections that Plutarch had with leading Romans. He was born in 45 AD in the Greek city of Chaeronea, and he studied in Athens under the Platonist Ammonius in the later 60s AD. He and Ammonius both attended the games at Delphi, where the Emperor Nero performed in 68. And he may also have served as part of the embassy that greeted the Emperor Vespasian's assertion of power in 69. At some point in the late 60s or early 70s, Plutarch met the senator Lucius Mestrius Florus, the patron through which he would secure Roman citizenship. Now, when someone received Roman citizenship, they also took on a Roman name that derived from that of the person who sponsored them. And so in Plutarch's case, this would be Mestrius. So while Plutarch never mentions his Roman citizenship status in his surviving works, it's known from a dedicatory inscription erected in Delphi that marks him as Mestrius Plutarch the priest. And so this inscription indicates that, like Philopappos, Plutarch advertised both his Roman citizen status and his Greek religious office in a certain context. So Plutarch first traveled to Rome in the 70s. He apparently met up with Florus, traveled around Italy with him, and then began giving philosophical lectures to Florus's friends. Although the lectures were in Greek, Plutarch already knew Latin, And he used his time in the capital to do historical research, reading things. I mean, it's certain he read, for example, Cicero and Julius Caesar. This visit to Rome encouraged Plutarch to begin work on the lives of the Caesars, a long set of biographies of the Roman emperors written in Greek that commenced with Augustus and ended with Vitellius, the last emperor before the reigning emperor Vespasian took power. And Vespasian is the emperor, and Plutarch is bouncing around there. Plutarch also likely drafted a declamation entitled On the Fortune of the Romans during this time. So these works show Plutarch's great interest in Rome and its history. But the Caesars particularly reflect the concerns of a philosophically inclined, Greek-speaking Roman looking to make a distinctive statement about the just government of the empire. Because the basic project in the Caesars consisted of profiling the character of past rulers in ways that emphasize how well they succeeded in ruling according to the Greek philosophical principles of self-control and justice. So Plutarch wrote as a Roman, addressing other Romans about their shared history, but he did it in a fashion that simultaneously highlighted his Greek philosophical background. And as Plutarch's career progressed, he became ever more adept at presenting himself simultaneously as a Roman insider and a Greek outsider, who offered practical advice and moral training to Roman audiences based on Hellenic philosophical principles. So Plutarch made at least 2 additional trips to Rome in the 80s and 90s, continuing to give lectures and offering his instruction to senators in person, much as he'd done in the 70s. But Plutarch faced a bit of a challenge, though, after the year 96. Plutarch was very much a creature of the Flavian dynasty, and he did quite well under the reign of the Emperor Domitian. But the Emperor Domitian was assassinated in 96, and this instituted a very dramatic change in the political climate, where people associated with Domitian sort of scrambled to reposition themselves to establish their authority in a new regime with new conditions. And this was particularly true for Plutarch after the Emperor Trajan took power in 98 AD. At that point, there was a major shift in Plutarch's literary program. So he created 2 series of texts addressed to or featuring prominent Roman senators of provincial origin. The first of these consisted of a set of works focused on practical ethics that might guide elite behavior in appropriately philosophical ways. These were dedicated to the consul Fundanius and our friend Philopappos. So these show that Plutarch directed the work specifically to men we know straddled the Greek and Roman world during this moment of transition. A passage in On Feeling Good, one of the works that mentions Fundanus even speaks directly to this new Trajanic context in which Greeks from the East could aspire to the consulship. So it chastises those who are never satisfied with the honors they earned. Some who enjoy prominence in local Greek cities complain that they do not wear senatorial shoes. If they do wear senatorial shoes, they complain that they are not praetors. Sorry, we'll go back. Those who are praetors, they complain that they are not yet consuls. And if they're consuls, they complain that they were named last and not first. Now that might be a little obscure to us. It wouldn't be obscure to someone in that context, but the last but not first comment refers to a desire to serve as a position that's called consul ordinarius. And this is one of the 2 men who give their name to the Roman year. So each Roman year is named according to the people who are consuls. No Greek had served as consul ordinarius until 105. And so this particular anxiety among Greeks must be very, very new, right? This just happened when Plutarch is talking about this. And so these ethical works then updated Plutarch's literary brand to a moment where Greeks are now occupying the rung of Roman imperial authority right below that of the emperor. And Plutarch is now an authority for how one could practically apply Platonic philosophy to a Trajanic world where the aspirations of elite Greeks and Romans had rapidly converged. But the most famous thing that Plutarch works on also appears roughly at this moment. That's the Parallel Lives. The Parallel Lives were published in stages. I think they began as an experiment with an initial series of lives pairing prominent Greek figures with leaders of the Roman royal and republican past. But all told, this becomes such a successful project that at least 23 pairs appeared between 98 and Plutarch's death around the year 120. And the Parallel Lives attempted to make usable the shared Greek and Roman historical legacies that Romans like Plutarch could claim as their own. with both Greek and Roman historical materials integral to this project, Plutarch doesn't attempt to blend them, though. What he attempts to do is to take these two distinctive traditions and use both Greek and Roman exemplars because the historical traditions are both his own. They have no inherent unity, but they're unified in the person of the narrator who paired them and in the cultural universe within which he bases his moral instruction. And so this is, in a sense, a new, practical, and usable history suitable for men like Philopappos, the very sort of elite Romans of provincial origin that the 2nd century Roman Empire is creating. And Plutarch's insight was that the presentation of the past as the sum of virtuous and vicious actions of singular individuals made Greek and Roman history mutually intelligible as a source of moral instruction. And it also pointed towards the sort of behaviors that Roman elites of all cultural origins could imitate in order to make the Greco-Roman present and future function according to the moral teachings of philosophy. So Philopappos and Plutarch both give us different ways of displaying a figure's distinctive, overlapping, but not competing Greek and Roman identities. Their younger contemporary, the historian Appian, undertook a unique literary project that defined how this Roman Empire of many different peoples developed. So Appian was born in Alexandria, Egypt, around 95, and he died in Rome around 165. And so he's a younger contemporary of Plutarch and Philopappos. He lived in Egypt until 117 AD when he fled as Jewish rebels threatened the capital of Alexandria. And like Plutarch, Appian wrote in Greek, but he read Latin and he held Roman citizenship. And like Philopappos, he also held imperial office and a priesthood in Rome. In Appian's case, this consisted of a position called procurator, which is a high government position writing legislation that Appian held during the reign of the emperor Antoninus Pius. He also held a priesthood in the capital in a very prominent temple. And so like Philopappos and Plutarch, Appian very much belongs in the 2nd century world where Greek elites entered the highest levels of Roman political and social life. So these biographical details provide us with a rough sense of the career of a man whose provincial origins, Greek language, and Roman honors all remained parts of a complicated and layered identity that Appian believed many of his contemporaries shared. And the very first sentence in Appian's Roman history reveals the author's interest in tracing how Roman expansion created a state that joined together many different peoples without requiring them to abandon their historical distinctiveness. So Appian says, I intend to begin writing the history of the Romans. I believe it's necessary to mark the geographical boundaries of the peoples or the nations, the ethnoi, the Romans governed, Arcusi. So these are the two basic concepts that I think are really, really important. This is in a sense the decoder ring that allows us to understand what Appian is doing, and also in a sense the decoder ring that lets us understand what the Roman Empire is to these Greek-Roman Greeks that we're talking about. The concepts that we're exploring are ethnos, which means basically nation or people, ethne, which is a plural of ethnos, and this is again nations, and then arche, empire. And Appian explains that his goal in writing this history centers on these sort of characteristics, these concepts, this concept of the ethnos, the nation, and the arche, the empire. So Appian says that it is his goal in writing this history to understand the character of each ethnos by describing the actions of the Romans towards each one, with the result that I may learn the weakness or power of the ethne and the excellence or power of those who took them over. Appian wrote each part of his work relating to each ethne separately until they are incorporated into the Roman arche, the Roman Empire. And then once the Roman conquest of Egypt is accomplished, Appian believes that the Roman arche, the Roman Empire, is finished, it's completed. And then the narrative changes. So the first batch of books in Appian's narrative talks about Roman interaction with Italy, Roman interaction with Spain, Roman interaction with Greece, Roman interaction with Carthage, Roman interaction with Mithridates and Asia Minor, Roman interaction with Syria. And then after the conquest of Egypt, the history becomes linear. It just becomes a Roman history, like any other Roman history. And so the structure changes from something that's organized around ethnography to something that's organized chronologically. And he completes the history with a final book that outlines the condition of the Roman arche, the empire, in his day by describing things like the present military force of the Romans and the resources that the arche enjoys from each of the ethne that make up the empire. And so the geographically diffuse series of mini histories then ends with a conventional linear history of the Roman state after Augustus that focuses on the empire as a collected identity. So Appian's discussion of Italy shows that, so this is the arche and the structure. Appian's discussion of Italy shows that he does not mean that an ethnos becomes extinct when it joins the Roman arche. Italy, Appian wrote, had the most of all of the ethne, including the ethnos of the Romans themselves. So in a discussion of a humiliating defeat humiliating Roman defeat by the Samnites in 321 BC, Appian records Samnite leaders deciding what to do with the captured Roman soldiers. And he says that they spoke about how a response that was too brutal would take away from the two ethne, which means the Samnites and the Romans, all hope of mutual accommodation by doing an irreparable wrong, while a fair treaty would establish peace between the two ethne, again, the Samnites and the Romans. So the Romans here are an ethnos, all to themselves, just as the Samnites are, just as the Greeks are, just as everyone else in the Mediterranean is, even though the Romans are also the original creators of the Roman arche. So Appian then explains why the nature of the Roman arche empire permits so many different nations, ethne, to exist within its political structure when he talks about the social war, a conflict between Rome and its allies that convulsed Italy in 90 BC. Appian talks about how the social war broke out among the many ethne, nations of Italy, because 2 generations of Roman politicians excited Italians to desire Roman citizenship so that they would share in leadership rather than being subjects. So in Appian's telling, the tension causing the social war grew out of a fundamental Roman misunderstanding about what their empire, their arche, actually was. Because Appian believed that their arche was a collective achievement of a group of ethne, a group of nations, the Romans included, but not the Romans exclusively, that created a political superstructure that joined all of these nations in a common enterprise without eliminating the features that made each ethnos distinctive. And so Appian then makes clear that the social war ended when the Romans recognized this fact and extended citizenship progressively to more and more of the Italian ethne until the whole of Italy came into the Roman politeia, the Roman state. And these Italian nations did not cease to exist even after they became members of even after they became citizens of the Roman arche. They remained distinctive ethne, fully integrated into both the Roman Empire, its arche, and the Roman political structure that governed that empire. So Appian's own description of his identity places him comfortably within a Roman arche, a Roman empire that offers citizenship and positions of leadership to members of all of the different nations, ethne, that comprise it without compelling any of them to abandon their ethnic identity. So Appian describes his background in the preface to this massive work. He says, "I am Appian, the Alexandrian, a man who reached first rank in his homeland, that's Egypt, and pleaded cases in Rome before the emperors until they judged me worthy of being their procurator." And at the same time, as we read into this, Appian also takes pride in the immense resources that my kings, the Ptolemies, possessed after the breakup of Alexander the Great's empire. Egyptian, Greek, and Roman history are both Appian's, totally and completely. So although Appian framed himself as an Egyptian native and a Roman official in his history, he assumed a very different pose in the most personal surviving reference to his life. This is found on a sarcophagus, and this is one of my favorite monuments of all time. It's a sarcophagus that now serves as a storage bin for gardening tools in the Vatican. So you can see the sarcophagus right there with the gardening tools, the pots and other things in it. It contains 2 columns of Greek poetry that commemorate Appian and Eutychia, his wife of 31 years. The lines mention neither Appian's Alexandrian origins nor his procuratorship. Instead, they define him as holding the honor of a priesthood of all golden Rome's Tyche through the king of Ausonian might. This is a probable reference to a priesthood here. One of the 12 priesthoods of the cult of Rome and Venus centered on this temple, the biggest temple in the entire city of Rome, the biggest new temple in the entire city of Rome, a double temple that greets everybody coming from the Colosseum into the Roman Forum. This is a temple that was begun by the Emperor Hadrian and completed by Antoninus Pius. And this is the temple where Appian was a priest. So these lines then celebrate Appian's devotion to his wife, and also his service to Rome in one of the most prominent ways possible. So this portrait of a devoted Roman priest and husband, it seems, was the public identity that Appian most wanted people in Rome to remember. But it's, of course, written in Greek poetic verse. So Appian then offers us a neat parallel to the Philippopos monument with which we began. He was simultaneously a pious Roman priest, a proud Alexandrian native, a Greek author, and a prominent Roman official. Like Philippopos and Plutarch, Appian simply chose which of those identities to evoke depending upon the context in which he found himself. Those choices didn't make him any more or less Roman or Alexandrian or Greek or Egyptian. They instead simultaneously affirmed his place among the various ethne, nations, that made up the Roman arche, empire, and his role among the citizen leaders of that Roman state. Millions of people across hundreds of years have shared this experience. In fact, one could argue that this is the fundamental Greek experience across all of time. Greeks have created, lived in, and changed multi-ethnic, to use Appian's term, societies in every continent across the entirety of Greek history. This is as true of the archaic Greek emporia that Denise has studied, as it is of the modern Greek community in Toronto or the 19th century Ionian Islands that Tom has worked on. It's also true of Rome, a state to which Greeks first migrated, then joined as citizens, then governed as emperors, while their own non-Greek portions of the state fell away. Greeks held together, administered, and protected the Roman Empire for more than a millennium. And during that time, the Roman arche that once belonged to many ethne, Appian, for example, describes nearly 100 different ethne in his history, shrunk to become a state of just one, Greeks. When Turkish cannonballs and musket shots breached the walls of Constantinople, they captured the capital held by the people that we might now call Greeks. But at that moment, everybody knew them as the last Romans. So if we're looking closely, though, we can see these Constantinopolitans are simultaneously the heirs of both Greece and Rome. And they would not for a minute understand why nearly 600 years later, we are trying to categorize them as one and not the other. It's important that we recognize their complexity and perhaps learn from their story as Greeks and Romans when we think about our contemporary world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That was an impressive sort of view of that moment and an exploration of the questions of identity at that time. So thank you so much for that. We will now open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please either raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, or you can type your question in the chat, and we will, and I will call on you or read out your question, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Andrew, my colleague Andrew Devereaux from the History Department, I will call on you first.
Thank you. I think Jeff Barnow's hand was up before mine, but I'm happy to go second.
Please.
Okay. Well, Ed, thank you so much. This is such a fascinating talk. I'm really struck by this question of identity being inheritable or malleable. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the way that Appian is using these terms of ethnos and ethne. I'm really wondering about how a person's ethnos could change, if that was possible through the course of their life. If one, for instance, obtained citizenship in a new locale, giving up their citizenship of birth in cases where that's done, or are there certain characteristics that are associated with particular ethne? And are those characteristics understood to follow a person down and then through their generations, through their offspring and their children and grandchildren? Or are these characteristics mutable and determined more by the cultural forces of where a person lives, rather than some sort of understanding of ethnicity being inherited? Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So I think there's a couple ways to answer that. So with Appian, there's a very interesting thing, and Mira Wahlberg and I have talked a lot about this. There is one group that he does not consider an ethnos, but he calls them a genos, which means basically, I mean, if we're translating that really, really roughly and horribly, it's like a race. He believes that Jews are unassimilable. And so he calls them a genos and not an ethnos. And so all of the other ethnoi retain their character, because he's very interested, he says at the outset, in what is distinctive about each of these ethne. But he also believes that they can participate in the arche. The arche is this like larger superstructure, and everybody from all ethnic groups who are not Jewish can participate in this. All nations can participate in this. As you get into the 3rd century, you see an even more detailed and complicated analysis of this when the Constitutio Endeminiana gives everybody in the Roman state citizen, everybody in the Roman Empire gets Roman citizenship. What you see then are historians like Cassius Dio, and I see Tyler is here. What you see are historians like Cassius Dio begin talking about like the Emperor Caracalla, who embodies the characteristics of Syrians and North Africans and Gauls. And all of the bad things that like are wrapped up in Caracalla come from all of those sort of the blending of all of those different ideas. I think what Appian would say is that what Rome represents is this bigger thing that you join and you learn about and you're absorbed into. And the idea in the 2nd century is there are people who are capable of doing this, and then there are people who are not as capable of doing this. And the people who are capable of doing this deserve to have this full incorporation, and the other people sit kind of a little bit below that. And the big challenge in the 3rd century is when everybody now has Roman citizenship, then you get this discussion of like, well, what about your ethnicity do you retain? And what if you're of multiple ethnicities? What does that mean? And so I think that when we're in the 2nd century, there is a sense that if you're from a place and you belong to an ethnos, you share some basic characteristics of that ethnos, but you eventually can be a part of this bigger thing. And this bigger thing just gives you another level of identity and another level of kind of participation and membership that is fully and completely meaningful. But it just exists in a different kind of register. Yeah, so I think when you do see them talking about this, there is a sense that if you belong to an ethnos, you share characteristics with other people from that ethnos, but that doesn't mean you're only that and forever that. It means that there's also this bigger thing that you can be part of, and you can share in everything that comes along with that as well.
Thank you, Ed. Jeff, I'm sorry I missed you earlier.
You didn't miss me at all. This is a wonderful talk. I enjoyed it immensely. I'm going to ask a question, though, about an earlier period with the people who missed the boat, the Etruscans. The Etruscans are people who, what were they assimilated? Were they annihilated? They were certainly very important in their relation to the Greeks, or not maybe for the Greeks, but the Greeks certainly noticed them and were aware of them. And I would say that the Romans were sort of competing with the Etruscans for Greek attention in some ways. And obviously the Etruscans did not become a mighty empire, but they disappeared. And so they, in that sense, they missed the wonderful boat that you're talking about, the Ark, maybe.
That's great. No, Jeff, it's you're the arc is sorry, I'm caught on that. Yeah, no, they did. So when Appian, for example, is talking about the social war, he talks about the Umbrians and the Etruscans, and they are ethne. Like the Etruscans are not one ethnos. He actually sees it as sort of something that is even more, even more disparate, down to like they is different from, I don't know, Terracina. But he feels that all of those places in Italy, all of the different ethne in Italy retain their basic character, even when they're brought into the Arche. And so when Appian is working, you still have people who can read Etruscan. You still have, I think, inscriptions that are written in Etruscan. Not many, it's about to go away, but it hasn't totally gone away. You do have people who are speaking Oscan, I think, still. You definitely still have Greeks in Southern Italy, because you still have Greeks now in Southern Italy. So I think what Appian believes is that these Italian ethne, they're further along in their incorporation into the Roman Arche, because when Appian's writing, they've been citizens for 210, 220, 230 years. So, this is a very, very deep connection that these people have to the Arche that is a little different than, say, Egyptians, who very few of them have Roman citizenship, and the ones who do really feel distinct from the people who don't. But I think Appian still has the ability to say, look, like everything that was once distinctive remains distinctive. It's not extinct, but they all are participating in this larger structure to a greater or lesser degree. And, and that's the great benefit and the sort of wonder of this structure, is it allows you to still be who you were, and organize these things.
I don't know if the first kings of Rome were nominally Etruscan, but that doesn't become part of their founding legend, really, somehow.
Well, there's actually a really—
Aren't they outgrown more than incorporated?
We don't have Appian, we don't have much of Appian talking about the kings, but we do have Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who's writing about 100 years earlier. Dionysius of Halicarnassus actually makes the argument that the first Romans are Greeks. And he gives a sort of origin story that talks about people from Hercules. Hercules' wounded soldiers set up a camp on the Palatine. And you do have, what is it? Tarquinius Priscus is half Greek, half Etruscan.
Right.
So you do have the very core of Roman stories about who they are and how they developed is this idea that we've always been different peoples. We take the best of what's around us, we offer opportunities for them, and our society is stronger because we have this idea of, taking the talented people and giving them a position in our society. And the story that's actually said, or actually told about Tarquinius Priscus, is this is a guy whose dad comes from Corinth because there's a tyrant named Cypselus he can't get along with. He comes to Italy, he marries into a family in Tarquinia. And because he's half Greek, there's a ceiling to how far he can go in Tarquinia. He decides to go to Rome. And when he goes to Rome, they recognize his talents and they make him king. And so this is a Roman story from the very beginning. The state has always been about this kind of superstructure that brings new people in. And the stories we're told is from the very beginning, there are Greeks in that picture.
Right. Tarquinius the Proud, the last king, I believe, he maybe puts an end to that inclusiveness of the Etruscans. Is that possible? Because they don't hark to it. I mean, I understand the American dream aspect of this, but Etruscans disappeared. I'm sounding like D.H. Lawrence, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but I think the Republic is more restrictive, but the Republic actually even has moments like when the Claudii show up, they are incorporated as patricians. They're immediately brought in I think 503 BC, they're brought in at the very highest level of the Roman state again. So, the state retains that ability to do this. And that's, I think, what in a sense ends the Etruscans. They just sort of absorb into a Roman polity, more through sort of agglomerate, more through kind of assimilation than destruction.
So I think we have questions accumulating in the chat, and also Tyler has had his hand up for a while. So Tyler, will go to you because you actually raised your hand before the chat questions came in, and then I'll come to the chat questions. Thank you for being patient.
Thank you, Professor Watts, for your very engaging talk. I think it's given me a lot to think about for some time. I was wondering, what role, if any, do you think the extension of citizenship in 212 fits into this discussion of identities in the Greek and Roman world?
Yeah, this is a really great question because the extension of citizenship in 212 is a shock to a lot of these elites. The model, again, the 2nd century model is, this is a Roman arche that has citizens who are basically the owners of this thing and subjects who are not. And the 2nd century model is anyone who's worthy can become a citizen. There's a great oration that Aristides gives where he says, you know, the great thing about Rome is anyone who's talented, anyone who's meritorious gets Roman citizenship, and they are citizens. They are, you know, the Roman state is still calling itself a res publica because it belongs to those citizens. But Aristides says there are other people who are just subjects. And, you know, that's because that's what they deserve to be. And what Caracalla in 212 does is he extends citizenship to everybody all of a sudden. And so there is a real and profound disorientation among these elites, the sort of descendants of Appian, to try to figure out what that means. You know, they had this idea that the worthy people were citizens, the unworthy people were subjects, and now everybody is a citizen. How do you square this? And so there's a lot of difficulty in the 210s and 220s and into the 230s about figuring out, like, what is the appropriate space for a Syrian to run the Roman state, and what can they do? So one of the great challenges with the Emperor Elagabalus is this is a guy who's a Syrian and believes that the Roman state now incorporates everybody. So I'm a Syrian priest, and I'm going to dress like a Syrian priest, and I'm going to do what a Syrian priest does, and I'm going to dance like a Syrian priest in public, and I'm going to bring my giant god that's a rock to to the Roman Forum and put him in a giant temple overlooking the Colosseum, and everybody's going to be totally fine with that. And they're not. And across the 3rd century, you see a process of kind of negotiating this. You know, what does it mean to have an emperor like Macrinus, who is a Moor, and, you know, is not of elite, he's an equestrian, he's not a senator. What does that mean exactly to have somebody who is from a barbaric sort of sounding part of the Roman Empire along the Danube become emperor? And it takes a while for them to figure that out. And that's really the thing that the Constituents and the Neon unleashes. It's not that Romans don't believe Syrians should be citizens or senators or emperors. It's that they don't believe all Syrians should be senators or citizens. They believe some should still be subjects. And so the real disorientation is when everybody all of a sudden has this status, and a lot of the elites aren't ready for it. But by the 250s, this isn't really a problem anymore. You know, that kind of discussion really has faded out, and it's more sort of discussions of class and background, and, you know, less discussions of, well, this person has the ethnic character of a Gaul and therefore shouldn't be in charge.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, I'll read out, there are a few questions in the chat. 2 from John Marmara in Australia, who says hello from Australia, and then has a question about the Greek language and how it relates to Greek identity. So Greek became the official language of the Roman Empire in 622. Many of the famous texts of Roman history, including that of Anna Komnene, were only written in Greek. Why and how did the Greek identity of the Roman Empire disappear? But I take that to be related to the aspect of language. And then the second question that he has is what role the Latin Church played in the destruction of the Greek identity, of a Greek identity in the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so these are great questions. I think that the answer to the Greek identity question, the first question, is really interesting because, you know, Greek is used for law and other texts from the time of Justinian, you see at various times, you see Greek and Latin, depending on what part of the empire you're in, all the way into the 11th century. There are Latin speaking parts of the Roman Empire very, very late, much later than we imagine. But Greek becomes the central language to this, really starting in the later 6th century. And in the 7th century, it's overwhelmingly so. But why do we not think that there's a Greek identity to the Roman Empire? It's a long story, but it starts with Charlemagne, and I've done this in other contexts. But basically, what you have in the middle to late 8th century is a process by which the city of Rome tries to declare its independence from the Roman Empire. This starts with the fall of the city of Ravenna to the Lombards. But ultimately, what you have is a papal effort to bring the Franks in as protectors of the city of Rome. And in the mid-750s, the city of Rome switches from being under the control of the Roman emperor in Constantinople to being what it calls the head of a Roman Republic of St. Peter under the protection of the Frankish kings, and ultimately becomes part of the Holy Roman Empire. There's a discourse that you see with Charlemagne in particular that starts around the coronation in 800, where people supporting Charlemagne's efforts to become, to take the claim of Roman emperor, say that the empire in Constantinople is no longer Roman because a woman is in charge, because the Empress Irene has overthrown her son. And this means that it's no longer Roman, and therefore the title of Roman emperor is up for grabs. And by the way, we have this document called the Donation of Constantine that says that the Roman Empire of the West belongs to the popes to give charge to whoever they want. And so they give it to Charlemagne. And this becomes the way that in the West, at various moments when there's tension between the Empire of Constantinople and people in the West, they bring out this canard that says that the empire is, Greek. It's not Roman anymore. And so the Roman identity of whatever state you want to call a Roman Empire is never in question in Constantinople. The people in Constantinople call themselves Romanoi. They call that empire, they call their language Romanica. The empire is Romania. And when people in the West are being honest, they call it that too. So when the 14th century, early 15th century, there's a Byzantine emperor who goes to the West and tours Western capitals to try to get support against the Ottomans. Everybody in London, in Paris, in Italy, they fet this guy as the Roman emperor. Everybody looks at him like he's a sort of time capsule from the ancient past. They all acknowledge he's Roman. But when the Fourth Crusade, a couple hundred years earlier, sacked the city of Constantinople, this wasn't Roman, right? These were Greeks that we were attacking. And so this blend, this sort of nebulous, is this Greek or is this Roman thing, is actually a product of the West. It's not a product of the East. And as a product of the West, what we sort of see is it is introduced at moments where the West wants to take advantage of this to do something usually violent or aggressive against the East. And they use their claim of Romanness as a way to do something against these people who are, in the Western eyes, seem to usurp the claim of being Roman. But if you're in Constantinople, this is unproblematic, right? You are Roman, and you wouldn't even understand that question. And one of the biggest problems that you have in the relationship between Charlemagne and the emperors in Constantinople in the early 9th century is a contest about, is Charlemagne's claim legitimate? And in Constantinople, they really do not want to acknowledge that it is. The other question, the Latin Church. Okay, so that's actually, so I will give you a quote from Martin Luther that I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember it exactly. But Martin Luther says that the papacy stole the Roman Empire from Constantinople and gave it to the Germans. So, there is very clearly a sense in the West that the Latin Church has a very, very real role in that historical enterprise of taking away Romanness from the people that we now call Greeks. And Luther himself says this in a thing where he's attacking the papal usurpation of secular power. So lots of people see that role across a long period of time. And it's, you know, it's a pretty significant role. Yeah.
Now, Christine Hunefeld, our colleague in history, has a question too about tolerance. And her question is, she says that construing several identities over time implies a great deal of tolerance, which perhaps is missing today. What made this tolerance possible? Was it compatible interests in opposition to group interests, or self-restraint, or moral instruction? Or was there this tolerance?
Yeah, this is a really great question, because Roman history is really, really long. And so you do see, and I think the best way to show this is in looking at Roman interactions with Greeks. There's a very long set of cycles where Romans are receptive to Greeks, and then there is a xenophobic reaction, and then they're receptive to Greeks, and there's a xenophobic reaction. I mean, this starts in the 3rd century BC. But I think the other thing that is very common in that is that there is a general trend towards believing that basic narrative, that narrative of the 2nd century, that the people who are worth being part of, you know, the people who are worth giving a role as citizens in this state should have that role. And so when you see, for example, the first batch of Greeks coming into the Roman Senate, this occurs really in the 70s and 80s AD. And it occurs after the Emperor Nero goes to Greece and tries to build a base of power by touring Greece, going to Greek festivals. Nero is particularly incompetent in doing this, but he's so popular in the Greek world that actually there are 3 fake Neros who show up in the 20 years after Nero's death, supported by people in the Greek world, because Nero's efforts were important. But there is a reaction against this in Rome that leads to the death of Nero, and leads to Italians being more willing to entertain the fake Neros than Greeks. And so what you get ultimately is then a kind of move by the emperors in power in the 80s and 90s to bring Greeks into the Senate and then elevate them to the highest ranks of the senatorial order, and give them consulships and give them very high level consulships, because there is an understanding that the intolerance was a kind of final spasm of a previous moment. And the new moment really is a moment where Greek elites need to be in these senatorial spaces. By the middle part of the 2nd century, Roman emperors are writing autobiographies and philosophical works in Greek, not because they are Greek and not Roman, but because they don't really see there as a necessary difference. You know, the cultural language of philosophy is Greek. And if you're Marcus Aurelius writing to yourself about, you know, the way you're processing your difficult days, you do it in Greek because the language is better suited to it. You could have done it in Latin. He writes Latin just as well as Greek. But Greek is a more appropriate language to what he's doing. And so there's a sort of progressive evolution of this that I think reflects a basic level of tolerance, but I think more a level of kind of understanding that the Roman state is built on the talents of all kinds of people. And what made Rome distinctive from every other ancient society that it came into contact with is Rome's ability to identify those talents and its willingness to incorporate the people who possess them into that state at the highest possible levels. And to Romans, this goes all the way back, you know, to the very beginning of who they are and what their state looks like. So I think that we can say that there is tolerance, but I wouldn't say that this is a generalized tolerance to everybody. I'll give an example and then I'll shut up. But there's an example after the Constitutio Antoniniana in the city of Alexandria, where the city of Alexandria was kind of a special status place where, because it was a Greek city in an overwhelmingly not Greek province, Alexandrian citizenship meant you could go into the city, but if you were not an Alexandrian citizen, you could not. But to become a Roman citizen from Egypt, you had to pass through Alexandrian citizenship. So if you are just a regular Egyptian and you want to become a Roman citizen, you have to get Alexandrian citizenship first, and then you get Roman citizenship. So when the universal citizenship grant is issued, everybody in Egypt now has Roman citizenship. And so they believe, well, Alexandrian citizenship is just a way station. We must have Alexandrian citizenship too. And so the Nile is flooded with people coming up to Alexandria from Egypt. And Caracalla has to issue an edict saying, no, native Egyptians are not allowed in Alexandria. They don't have Alexandrian citizenship. They have Roman citizenship, but not Alexandrian citizenship. And he says in it, you can identify native Egyptians very easily because they talk differently, they smell differently, they look differently, they dress differently, and they culturally distinguish themselves from Alexandrians. So there's a huge amount of what we would call prejudice there. I mean, it's just ridiculous, the sort of stereotyping that you see in these 3rd century discussions. But at the same time, that really deep prejudice and intolerance exists against this high level tolerance where everybody who is worthy should participate at the highest level of the Roman state. And so Rome is a very difficult thing for us to talk about with modern terms, because there's a lot of tolerance if you belong in the club. There's a lot of intolerance if you don't. But it doesn't sort of it doesn't fit along like very convenient lines that we would identify. It's much more, I think, complicated and based on presentation, mastery of culture, ability to speak in the right way. You know, it's remarkably tolerant and also remarkably intolerant in ways that I think we, as historians in the 21st century, struggle to really explain.
Thanks, Ed. Let me ask if anyone else has any other questions. And while you think about that for a moment, I'll just say part of being the master of ceremonies as I am is that I'm not able to give you the laudatio, that I would have. But I'll just say one very small thing, I guess, while people think about questions, which is because this is also a very personal talk in addition to, an intellectual talk. And I'll just say that the first time I ever heard of Ed was when my brother took his classes at Indiana University. And my brother became inspired by Ed and ended up doing a master's in late antique and Byzantine studies because of Ed. And I think that that's the kind of teacher Ed is. He inspires his students. And you also saw in the beginning of his talk how much he works to serve his students and to help them as well, as in the example of Natalie. But that's not the only, that's one of countless examples that I could give you. So in addition to being an amazing scholar and a great colleague with whom I'm privileged to work, I will say, I like this personal connection that we have, Ed. All right, one more question. Any comments on the ways the Ottomans used the terms room and rumelia? And sorry, I'm pronouncing that in the Greek way. I don't know how you actually pronounce those in English.
I think that way. So I haven't worked so much on that, but I will say that it is part of the Ottoman title that they use. And the reason they're using it is because they are, in the lists of, say, the titles of Suleiman, this is one of the nations that he controls, right? It's one of the ethnicities that he controls. And so when Appian is talking about this, Rome is the arche. When the Ottomans are talking about this, Rome is the ethnos, but it's not the ethnos of people who live in Rome. It's Greeks. And so I think that what you see there is, a recognition of what Greeks accomplished by being the people who made this state last. I know Cristina left, so maybe I can get away with saying this, but Italians lost their Roman Empire. The French lost their Roman Empire. The Spaniards lost their Roman Empire. The Greeks didn't. I mean, eventually they did, but 1,000 years after the rest of the world lost it. This is a real achievement, to take this state that was falling apart in other parts of the world and make it last and make it work and make it adaptable and give it this totally new characteristic. And that's why when that state gets absorbed by the Ottomans, that's why the people we call Greeks are called Rum. because it's their state. You know, they are the last ethnos left because they kept it, right? They maintained it. They are the ones who built it and strengthened it and, you know, allowed it to recover. And it's a very, very real achievement. And I think what's remarkable is seeing, I mean, Anthony Caldelas has done a lot of really great work on this, but seeing the field become Byzantine studies takes away the real achievement of 1,000 years of people who called themselves Romans. And we created a new name for them because it's inconvenient in Northwestern Europe. You know, we bought Charlemagne's line eventually. And that's, I think, the wrong thing to do. You know, you have to acknowledge this state is not just Romans. It's not the era of just the Romans, because when you look at what these people read, you look at the histories they preserved Herodotus, they preserved Thucydides, they preserved Xenophon, they preserved Arrian. That is their history, just like Cassius Dio and Polybius and, you know, things that we would see as Roman history. If you're in Constantinople in 1204 and someone says, give me the list of books you would read to know the history of your people, you know, you would start with Herodotus, you would go to Thucydides, you would go to Xenophon, you would have a full run, and it would include Cassius Dio, which is why we still have Cassius Dio. It would include Appian, which is why we still have Appian. It would include Procopius. It would include Anacolmena, right? It would include all of these different people, and they would not see that you have to differentiate Herodotus from Procopius from Appian, because it's all their history. And what we have managed to do in, you know, the 19th century sort of Northwestern Europe is cleave out various parts of that and create an identity for people living in Constantinople in the Middle Ages that doesn't make a lot of sense to people living in Constantinople in the Middle Ages. And, you know, I think one of the things that Byzantinists really need to do is get back to that, you know, get back to who these people were and their conception of their world and how that world was built. And that means moving a little up in time from where Byzantinists like to go. It means talking about people like Appian and not just starting with Procopius. But I think it's a really important thing that we need to do because it's part of the Greek story. It's part of, you know, the story of this entire culture and civilization. And we need to approach all moments of it on the terms that the people living in those moments would understand and accept.
Thanks. Just real quick, there are two comments in the chat. One is about national ideologies affecting archaeological or the way that archaeological discoveries are presented to the world. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. And then Manasi has a note in there too. I don't know if you missed it. If you missed it, you should read it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I think as all of us know, the way that, I'll use Byzantine again, the way that the Byzantine stuff has been treated in archaeology has been very unfortunate, not really very productive. You know, you do have these moments where people just, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, you just blow through the Byzantine stuff. You wouldn't even catalog it. You would just dig right through it. And, you know, when the Agora was excavated, a bunch of Byzantine churches were dismantled. They were cataloged. That was a more careful exhibition or excavation. But yeah, you're right that there is a very strong political element to the way archaeology functions. And there's also a privileging of certain periods and certain moments. I don't know if Tom is still here, but, you know, Tom has done a really, really good job of showing archaeologically what can be done if you're looking at the more recent archaeological past in the Greek world. And so I think that the way that archaeology has to work is you have to do the best you can to objectively record everything you're digging through. And that means if you're working in, you know, Smyrna and you want to dig in 19th century things, you need to acknowledge that there are, you know, of course, Greeks living in Smyrna. I think if you want to acknowledge the history of Constantinople, you need to acknowledge what Constantinople was like before the 1950s and what it's like after the 1950s, and look at some of the material changes there. So I think there's a lot of ways that modern politics affects the way archaeology is done. And I think the best way to do this is to try to be really true to your sources through all of the periods that you're touching, from literally like the plastic water bottles on the ground at the very top to whatever it is you find at the very bottom. But I think the true way to do archaeology is to just acknowledge the complexity of the people living in that space and try to do it on the terms those people would identify with and accept. And if you do that, you know, you're, I think, doing the best that you can. But it's unfortunate when you refuse to do that.
Thanks, Ed. And thank you everyone for attending the event.